Across the Fence, a big boost for Vermont food producers and consumers. We'll see how farmers are extending the growing season by packing away fresh, local vegetables during the coldest months of the year. Good afternoon and thanks for joining us. I'm Judy Simpson. One of the many challenges for food producers in Vermont is the relatively short growing season. Well, now at least part of the problem has been solved. Experts at UVM Extension have helped 10 Vermont farms improve the storage conditions and the quality of more than 420 tons of crops with an estimated value of more than $900,000. Keith Silva has more on helping farmers extend the growing season.
At Pete's Greens in Craftsbury, wintertime has become almost as busy as harvest time.
Our business is now almost as big this time of year as it is in August, so we're busy. We got lots of people in here washing and packing things. We harvest lots and lots of crops in October, and many of these crops we can store until the next June or so. But it's critical that conditions be just right. Just above freezing, super high humidity, those are the main characteristics for most crops. But if you get too warm or too cold away from that by much, your storage period really drops quickly.
Pete's Greens is one of the largest producers and distributors of organically grown storage crops like carrots, onions, and potatoes in Vermont.
This storage thing has really helped us to make a well-rounded year-round business where we have quality managerial staff that stays year after year and has really taken a lot of the crazy ebbs and flows out of vegetable farming in a climate like this. You know, we have 3-4 months of good growing around here, and the typical vegetable farm in the past was just ramping up like crazy, selling a bunch of stuff, ramping down super fast, and then everybody disappears. And it's really hard to build a business and build an economy like that. So this has been a really key part of us really having a better business.
For these vegetables to stay fresh for over 6 months, the temperature and humidity have to remain constant. Half a degree too high or too low means at least a week less of storage time. And any significant temperature changes mean disaster.
We once froze 40,000 pounds of potatoes here. It was a huge loss. It was very sad, and we just didn't have a proper system to monitor it in place.
In Vermont, Pete's Greens may be a major player in the marketplace when it comes to selling storage crops. But outside the Northeast, storage facilities can be several acres in size, making Pete's facility minuscule by comparison. So installing a proper monitoring system is much easier said than done.
This is the kind of stuff where you go online, you check out what, big storage facilities, they have a certain kind of monitoring system, blah, 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 and you contact that company. And you're just not speaking the same language. It's a very different, they're dealing with, acres of storages where people are spending maybe $250,000 to set up the proper monitoring and all this kind of stuff. And it's very different to be able to call up somebody and say, hey, I want the second smallest model of what you have because it's perfect for me. And to call up somebody and say, hey, I need something 10 times smaller than what you have. And that'll be perfect for me. And they're going to say, I have no idea what you're talking about. I don't know 10 times smaller.
So what these are little thermistors. They come from the medical industry. They're using catheters.
To find a right-sized monitoring system for his business, Johnson contacted Chris Callahan, an agricultural engineer with the University of Vermont Extension. Callahan's solution was to do what engineers do best.
We needed to build this simply because it didn't exist at a price point that made sense for our growers and frankly any small to medium-sized grower throughout the country and the world.
Employees at Pete's Greens would have to manually measure humidity using a sling psychrometer.
As we're slinging this through the air, the wick on the wet bulb of the thermometer is evaporating moisture into the air.
What Callahan designed houses one thermometer to gauge humidity and another to tell temperature.
One of the things that I found as a result of this project is the world of temperature and humidity measurement is really tailored to industrial and commercial processes or buildings. There isn't a whole lot out there that is cost effective and durable or reliable for agriculture, particularly agriculture at the scale and diversity that we see in Vermont. So part of the challenge has been finding cost-effective, reliable solutions for these types of environments.
Each thermometer connects to a microprocessor that transmits information over the internet. Johnson and his staff can then monitor temperature and humidity readings from anywhere using either a computer or a web-enabled device like a smartphone.
It's a continual process of identifying a need, having a conversation about what might work, giving it a shot with the understanding that it's an on-farm research project, and learning along the way, constant communication, what's working, what isn't.
Pete's Greens is one of 9 sites in Vermont where Callahan is installing these devices. The total cost per unit is about $200.
It's roughly the same cost of an agricultural thermostat, a good quality, accurate agricultural thermostat used in greenhouses and coolers currently. The processor does that calculation.
Johnson appreciates Callahan's assistance, and even more for someone who understands the needs of small, diversified vegetable farmers.
The UVM extension is super available. They come around, they see us, they stop in. You know, I can't say enough. They speak our language. They know you don't have to spend time trying to explain to them what you're trying to do. They get it, and then they go right to work figuring out how to make it happen. It's been indispensable, and it's helped create a new ag landscape in this state that really would have struggled to get going without having that backbone.
The storage facility at Pete's Greens stores more than carrots and potatoes. It's also a warehouse for knowledge that helps farmers monitor their needs as their businesses continue to grow. In Craftsbury, I'm Keith Silva with Across the Fence.
The Vermont Working Lands Enterprise Fund provided $40,000 for the winter crop storage project. As we noted earlier, the project has already improved monitoring and storage for more than $900,000 worth of storage crops. When it comes to apples, the cold weather months are the right time for pruning the trees. Whether you're a professional grower or a homeowner who's just trying to maintain that old apple tree in the backyard, here's UVM apple specialist Terry Bradshaw with some tips on pruning.
Today we're going to talk about renovating old, overgrown, sometimes abandoned apple trees. Apple trees are a very common part of the Vermont landscape, and a lot of farmhouses tend to have orchards growing around them. And as you move into rural areas especially, and even into suburban areas, you'll often get wild trees that are growing up. And sometimes these trees, which may or may not provide the best apples or really a kind of a traditional landscape tree in terms of fruit production, can be groomed to look pleasing and to provide a lot of wildlife benefit. These trees can also be used to graft later on onto varieties that you are looking for their fruit quality characteristics. So we're going to consider that as we discuss the pruning of these trees. Apple pruning is typically done in the late winter to early spring when the tree is still dormant. It's done so that there's no foliage in the way, so that you can actually see what the structure of the tree is. And you're also not disrupting the processes that are happening within the tree as it's growing and starting to form fruit and leaves and other tissues. So it's typically done in Vermont from February up through about mid-April. I often have people who ask me what they should do with their trees. Should they fertilize them? Should they spray them? And I always say, have you pruned them yet? And if the answer is not yes, then they shouldn't really do any other steps until you prune the tree, and meaning more than just a single year's pruning, but really gotten that tree into the form that you're looking for. If you prune the tree fairly heavily in 1 year and fertilize it at the same time, not only are you putting less growing points on that tree that the energy in the tree is going to go into, but you're adding more nutrients. You can have a real explosion of growth in that year. So typically, if you're going to prune a tree pretty hard, that should be the only management practice you do for the year. Aside from keeping the trunk clean and keeping the root suckers trimmed at the base throughout the summer, that's really about all you do. So prune it in the spring, get it up to the tree form you want, and then start to think about whether or not you want to invest in some of the other practices. I'm standing in front of 2 different apple trees, one which has been pruned and one which hasn't. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the horticultural reasons for pruning these trees and some of the reasons that you use for making cuts. We'll talk about the tools that you use and how to safely use them to make the cuts and clean the tree up so that it can reach the point that you're looking for in terms of having a pleasing tree form, as well as to increase the fruit production of the tree. So we'll look at this tree first. This is a tree that's already been pruned, and you can see in a lot of areas where there's open what I call windows to the sky. You can see openings between limbs so they aren't overcrowding and shading each other. That's the most important reason to prune your apple trees. The other thing that you want to do is remove dead, diseased, broken limbs, things like that, and then limbs that are crossing over each other so that they're growing into one another and not allowing that tree to have the airflow and the sunlight penetration that you need to grow a good crop of fruit and to have the tree just to be healthy. On your left here, on my left here, we have an unpruned apple tree, and you can see that a lot of branches are just piled on top of each other. You can also see, one thing that's important to point out is on both of these trees, there's relatively little wood growing down low, and there's two reasons for that. One is this is a region where the deer can munch away on any of the buds as they're coming out. But another reason, and more important, is as the tree grows up and becomes more constricted for sunlight, the branches in the top of the tree can get the sunlight and will grow healthy, whereas the branches down lower in the tree get shaded out, receive less sunlight, have less photosynthesis, and therefore those branches tend to be kind of spindly. And in fact, this branch I'm holding right now is actually dead, mainly because it just got choked out for sunlight. So what we typically are gonna do here is create openings in the tree so the sunlight can get down into those lower limbs, as well as lower the tree down a little bit so that we can still maintain it. If we do want to pick the fruit on it, we can get it within a range that's easily accessible, you know, maybe with a short ladder, but we're not trying to get way up into those 30-foot trees that you sometimes see in abandoned orchards. An apple tree, naturally, if you just let it grow on its own, will reach upwards to 25 up to 30 feet for a real vigorous tree. And those become very difficult to manage from pruning, picking, and also in the landscape. A lot of times they can encroach upon views, they can get into power lines, they can be a real problem. And there's a real art and a science to the pruning of these trees. And bringing the tree height down is one aspect that you really need to think about. You can't just come through with a saw and just cut everything off the top, and there's some reasoning behind that we'll talk about. So looking at this tree, I'm going to point out some of the main offenders that we want to address. So we obviously want to remove any dead wood out of the tree, but we don't want to just break it off, and we certainly don't want to leave what I call ugly stubs, which are these stubs that come off from the tree. Every cut needs to be horticulturally correct. That means that you cut off the branch at a point where it can easily heal over from where it grew out of the trunk, but where you're not cutting into the trunk itself, and you're not also leaving a stub where disease can get into. There's a lot of diseases, especially fungal diseases, that can infect little stubs of wood that aren't actively growing, and those can get into the trunk, they can get into the tree itself, and they can really shorten the lifespan of the tree. So this is the sort of stuff that we would remove. This is also a dead branch, another dead branch, and you'll see as we go over to this tree that I've removed a lot of that. So we've left this nice, relatively young, relatively vigorous wood. The wood that we left has this kind of orangish pink bark as opposed to gray, scaly, old bark. And this is fairly juvenile wood. This branch is probably maybe up to 6 or 8 years old. When you reach the real old branches, the old wood, they tend to have less fruit buds on them. They have less vigorous growth, and they'll eventually die out. So what we are looking to do is to maintain good, strong, what we call scaffold branches, which are the main branches of the tree, and then keep good, vigorous, this kind of pink-barked wood growing off of that. And that's where you're going to have your maximum foliage, your maximum photosynthesis, and your maximum fruit production. One thing I should point out on this branch, I often hear homeowners asking about lichen growing on the trees, and these trees are covered in lichen, and that's not a concern at all for home growers or even commercial fruit growers. It's an organism that lives on the surface of the bark. It's not invading into the tissues of the tree, and it basically it's actually photosynthetic, so it's producing some of its food from the sunlight that comes in, but it's also using some of the minerals that are just on the surface of this tree. It's not a concern. It flakes right off. You don't need to take it off. In fact, it looks kind of nice, but you don't need to worry that it's growing in and affecting the tree. You'll often have other growth that's growing up through them. You can see a fir tree that's basically growing right up through the center of this tree. Cleaning that out is what's called releasing the trees. And these trees have actually been released to some degree because they've been bush hogged, so it's been fairly cleaned out. But obviously they can't get that into the center of the tree. So it's important when you're in here to get in down near the base and to clean out the other growth, like this old apple sprout, this fir tree that's growing up through there, so that you don't have other growth that's sapping nutrients from the tree and growing up and making things a little bit more complicated. So we'll take that out, we'll take this root sucker off, and that's an important part of maintaining the trees. And that's something you can do all summer long. The growth will keep coming up through there, and you really need to keep the base clean. So we'll take those out.
Well, our thanks to Terry for sharing his expertise, and thanks to you for joining us. That's our program for today. I'm Judy Simpson. I'll see you again next time on Across the Fence.